This episode of The Unstarving Musician is powered by liner notes. Learn from the hundreds of musicians and industry professionals I've spoken with for The Unstarving Musician on topics such as marketing, songwriting, touring, sync licensing, and much more. Sign up for liner notes at unstarvingmusician.com. It's an email newsletter from yours truly in which I share some of the best knowledge gems garnered from the many conversations featured on The Unstarving Musician. You'll also be privy to the latest podcast episodes and liner notes subscriber exclusives. Sign up at unstarvingmusician.com. It's free and you can unsubscribe at any time. This is The Unstarving Musician. I'm Robonzo. This is my podcast. It features conversations with independent music artists and industry professionals with occasional special topic episodes featuring yours truly. A glimpse into the minds of my varied guests, all intended to help independent music artists better understand the marketing, business, and creative processes that empower us to do more of what we love. Make music. Welcome to episode 300, the final episode of The Unstarving Musician. That's right. No more new episodes, at least for now. I don't think I'll do any more new ones. I have gained enormous satisfaction from doing these 300. But it's time to move on to some other things. However, I will still mine the podcast interviews for things that I can share with you that I never really had time to do. So there's still much work to be done with the existing episodes. And who knows, maybe I'll throw an episode out there once in a blue moon. We'll see. I hope you will, before I get into today's topic, by the way, I hope you will continue following The Unstarving Musician and me, so you can keep up with all things about the podcast, The Unstarving Musician Project, and me, of course. The social channels include, in case you didn't know, Twixter, X, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Threads. I'm trying to get back into Threads. I don't know. I just really don't have that much time. But hey, why not? I'll try it again. My social handle, for sure you can find me at Robonzo Drummer, and there are a couple of others. You can also just go to unstarvingmusician.com to find all the social handles. So I hope you'll continue checking out, maybe check out some back episodes. I'm going to probably re-edit some of those to make them nicer for your listening pleasure. Also, before we get started diving into today's topic, I want to let you know, I think I've only mentioned it on one other recent episode, and that is that the Unstarving Musician's Guide to Getting Paid Gigs, the book that I wrote oh so long ago, is only $4.99 right now. You can go to unstarvingmusician.com/book or the show notes for this episode to find it on Amazon, on Kindle, or paperback. So check it out. It's less expensive than it's ever been. And if you get it, I hope you love it. And then lastly, I was just going to tell you, if you do start following me on socials for the first time, you might see maybe a complaint experiment I was doing about my love-hate relationship with social media. And I think everybody shares it for sure. So I did a little rant about it just to see what people would say and try and get a little motivation. And also during the process was looking for a source of inspiration and motivation, and I found it in the place I thought I would, and that was in the music marketing method community, which I belong to. And I got some great tips, and I also found out there are a couple of new lessons in the program that I'm part of for Instagram and Twitter to make it a get in and get out, so I don't have to lament over how much time I lost on social media, but to get things done and good things in a short amount of time, or the required amount of time, and no more. No death scrolling, as they say. Doom scrolling, right? Doom scrolling, that's the phrase. And so I always put a link to Music Marketing Method in the show notes for the episode. So if you want to learn more about what the heck that is, you can go there to the show notes for this episode and see what that's all about. It's a great community, and I'm happy to be part of it still. All right, today I'm going to talk to you about finding new fans and supporters via podcast guest appearances. I'm sure you've gathered I'm a fan of podcasts. That's why I did 300 plus podcast recordings and interviews on various podcasts. And I just want to start by saying that doing podcast interviews is a cost-effective way to promote your music, share your ideas, attract new fans, and build meaningful connections. And it's also a great way to practice for live radio interviews. One of my guests told me that And actually, it was someone from the Music Marketing Method group who she shared that with the group. She said it was fantastic. Now, my interview style is pretty casual, so maybe that helped a little bit. I'm not really sure because different podcast hosts absolutely have different styles. All right, so how do you get started if you've never been on a podcast before? Maybe you've wanted to, maybe you haven't thought of it, maybe you don't want to, but I really think you should consider it. And maybe you have, like I said, but you need a kickstart, a reboot. So the first thing you want to do is identify the best podcasts to pitch for a guest appearance. And by best, in air quotes, by best podcasts, I'm referring to those that will serve their audience while helping you achieve the goal of promoting your music or whatever work you're working on. This doesn't just apply to musicians, by the way. So if you happen to have dropped in, this applies to any creative work that you do, any type of work. So you can begin your search on, and by the way, so PR, public relations people will do this for you at a fee, at a cost. You can do a lot of it by yourself. Maybe you're not so DIY, or maybe you're doing too much DIY. That's pretty much the musician life. But this is worth trying to tackle yourself because you can probably get a better idea. You'll actually gain more benefit from doing it yourself, I think, in the relationship building department and community building department. Nothing against public relations people. They've been wonderful to me and the podcast. But begin your search on Apple Podcasts and Google or your favorite search engine. I've been using DuckDuckGo lately. I still use Google, of course, but I use DuckDuckGo more often. It's kind of cool, a little more private. And consider the following 3 tiers for your search. First, look for podcasts that speak directly to a portion of your audience. So, for example, one of the very first ones I asked if I could be a guest on was one called Gig Gab. It's a working musicians podcast. I'm acquainted with the original co-hosts. I know the last standing of the original co-hosts, are acquainted because of him. But anyway, I got a guest appearance. They talk to other musicians, which is, I talk to independent musicians for this podcast, or that's who my audience is. So I knew we had a lot of overlap. So they speak directly to a large portion of my audience. Great podcast, by the way, Gig Gab. You should check it out. The next tier of your search is for podcasts that have some overlap with your audience. So let me think about this one. This could be a musician's podcast, but so take me, for instance. I'm a drummer and a singer. I mostly do rock and pop genres of music, but I've been on a podcast for entertainment law that speaks a lot to musicians. I've been on a podcast that speaks to songwriters. I've written a little music, but that's not like my main thing. But I do talk to a lot of songwriters have talked to a lot of songwriters on the Unstarving Musician. I have also been on one. Now that one doesn't count. I'll mention that one in a minute. But let's see. I've also been on one for classical musicians. So not exactly the same audience, right? But we have some overlap. And it can be even a little further. It doesn't have to be, in my case, it wouldn't have to be music related. It could be a podcaster's podcast. That's a good example. And then in your third search, you want to include podcasts that touch on your general interests but have less overlap with your audience. So one that I was on, I just happened to see that they were looking for guests for their new season. It's called Set Lusting Bruce. It's all about Bruce Springsteen and people who've seen him. But it's also about music. The host, I learned, accepts guests who maybe haven't seen Bruce Springsteen before, but they have an interest in music. And so you just, you do the application and you might get an interview. So there is some overlap there because I know a lot of musicians have seen Bruce Springsteen in their lifetime. And I know a lot of independent music fans probably listen to that podcast as well. So they might know musicians that they would say, hey, there's this guy I heard on the Set Lusting Bruce podcast, and he's got this other podcast for independent musicians. You should check it out. So you can see how that would work for you. And notice how you're starting with the most relevant podcasts and progressing to somewhat relevant podcasts and eventually less relevant podcasts. Obviously, you want to use a spreadsheet or some other tool to track your efforts with the podcasts. What I've done in the past when I've been looking for podcasts to make a guest appearance on is I will track, of course, the podcast name, their website, the contact, the status of my inquiry to be a guest. And then if I got a guest interview, I would also keep a link to the interview, to the episode for later use. Like I ended up putting, I believe, all of them on the Unstarving Musician website. So that's something you should do, just so you can kind of keep track of your progress and just, keep it together. Now, let's talk about screening podcasts. The following questions will help you identify the best prospects for your guest pitch outreach. So, first question, does the podcast include guest interviews? I have quest interviews in my notes, but that's guest interviews. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, don't spend time pitching to podcasts that don't even do guest interviews. The next question is the podcast still active? So there's a lot of dead podcasts out there, and you want to target the ones that are actively publishing new episodes. So maybe in a few months, if I haven't published any new episodes in 4 months, I'm not going to be at the top of your list to pitch a guest appearance on. If it's been several months or more for their last episode, like I said, you probably don't want to include them on your list of prospects. At least not at the top. Things change though, so, I'm not saying that if, let's say, Keith Richards, I don't know, somebody that I admire has a PR rep contact me to see if I want to interview them, that I'm going to do another new episode if that happens, okay? And then look at the next question is, how many episodes has the podcast published? Getting a guest spot with a podcast that has published like over 1,000 episodes can be more challenging than getting one with under 50 episodes. So newer podcast hosts, consequently, they're generally hungry for quality guests like you, and quick wins for you can go a long way in building confidence and momentum. I'm not saying not to go after the ones that have 1,000 episodes, but I learned a long time ago in a sales job that I was in that you can go after the small prospects and win them very fast. And back then the saying was, you can get money in your pocket much faster than if you spend time going after the multi-million-dollar corporation and focusing all your time there. That could take forever, right? So going after the ones that have a smaller number of episodes would be a great idea. But again, don't avoid the ones that have thousands of episodes, because maybe they're going to be interested in you too. And the next screening bit is focus your efforts on podcasts with high-quality content and high-quality audio. These are the ones that will attract the most listeners to your interview. And look to their reviews for a little added insight, if you know what I mean, so you can understand what their podcast is about. Ask yourself if the podcast is a mutual fit. So you want to grow your audience, but you'll do well by thinking of their audience first, their being the podcast hosts or host. How can you give value to their audience? So by providing value to the podcast hosts and their audience, you'll more easily capture new listeners for your work and earn the support of the podcast host. Maybe they'll even recommend you to another podcast. And then give podcast hosts what they want and need. So we podcast hosts really appreciate guests who sound good, interview well, deliver value to our audiences, and promote your interviews. And professional photos of yourself for the podcast's episode artwork will go a long way in helping the host, as will a bio. They will also love you for an active online presence and a commitment to sharing your episode. So keep that in mind. And you can go the extra mile. This is a good one. I've had people do this for me, and I started doing it in my latter efforts to get guest appearances, and that is to suggest topics, questions, and the show titles for any podcast you want to be a guest on. Write it out for them. Most podcast hosts spend a lot of time on these things, so you would be doing them a solid. And once you write suggested topics, questions, and show titles up, that's very recyclable stuff that you can use, from one pitch to the next. With some tweaks, you got to customize these things. Don't blanket podcasts. Don't get yourself blacklisted. Be personal. So you want to craft a compelling guest pitch, and in doing so, consider the following points. So first, acknowledge the host and their podcast with genuine compliments. Listen to at least one of their episodes and tell the host what you loved about it. That means you actually have to listen to it or read the transcript. Introduce and detail your episode topic ideas. Like I mentioned earlier, having some topic suggestions would be super helpful. And provide social proof like testimonials, awards, past interviews, whatever accomplishments make sense for the podcast. Maybe you've got a new album coming out and that's super relevant for the podcast you want to be on. Could be the genre of music you're doing. Could be something about the way you recorded it. Who knows? Just think. Think about it. And then make it easy for them to schedule you as a guest by offering your schedule on a tool like Calendly. I know that Google Workplace or Google Calendar has a pretty slick scheduling tool in it now that you can also use. And there are a number of other ones, but that makes it easy. So basically, you want to avoid the back and forth. How about these times? How about that time? No, can't do this one. Much faster if you can just present your schedule and let them choose. And give their podcast an honest review on Apple Podcasts and let them know you did so. Podcast hosts love this. Okay, next, be prepared. Preparation will go a long way toward giving a quality guest interview. So start by preparing stories and anecdotes that you can use during the interview. And you want to be concise and answer their original questions in the interview. So that means be sharp, be rested, be caffeinated, whatever you got to do. And be conscious of your speaking time. We all love to hear our own voice, so, watch the clock. Don't ramble if you can avoid it. I know you can. And practice avoiding the use of filler words. You can do this by just recording yourself. Get on your voice recorder and practice, pretend. They might not edit any of your ums and you knows and yeah. They may not edit any of that stuff out. Or they may edit it all out and they'll be thinking, man, I wish this person was a better speaker. All those things have happened to me. And I know I have my own tics. After 300 episodes, I still have my vocal tics. I probably said 20 times since I started this episode. All right, next, get familiar with their show format. This is important. It's okay to ask them if there will be an opportunity to pitch like an event or a new release, new song, or a service during their interview. And if the host does permit you to do that, do so tactfully. But most importantly, ask, don't just assume. And be sure to use a quality mic and headset or earbuds. When you're doing your interview, assuming it's remote, maybe it's in person, so this wouldn't apply, but be in a quiet, distraction-free place for your remote interviews. And be mindful of your mic technique. You don't want to get too far away. You don't want to be too close. This is going to require a little practice if you're not used to speaking in a decent mic. And be sure to share the website or primary social handle, singular, either or, to show that the one that showcases your music, your other social media projects, and more. Avoid rattling off 5 social handles and a website. It makes it harder. You want to have a hub. So just say a website or say one social handle if that's your thing. And then after the interview, send a thank you note and ask the host if they need anything else from you. And then promote the heck out of your episode. You can apply all of these principles to radio, blog interviews, and YouTube. So that's pretty awesome, right? And if you need something for your press page, podcast interviews are a super addition. Just another reason why you want to do this. All right, so I am going to share a couple of bonus things with you. I have created a PDF on the best guest pitch email I ever got, and I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. It's a free download for you. And it basically is the anatomy of an awesome guest pitch email. And I think, to give credit where credit's due, the person whose email I created a template from, and I think this is right because I've seen this source. I believe it came from John Lee Dumas. I believe that's his name. He has a big podcast kind of education community. So just giving credit where credit is due. You can download that for free. And then also, there is finally coming a beta release of a program called Podcast Startup by yours truly and the Unstarving Musician. If you go to unstarvingmusician.com/podcast startup, you can sign up to get notified when the beta program has an opening. So you'll help me pilot it and get like some crazy low price on it, and you'll learn a lot, I promise. And you can optionally sign up for, I'm going to set it up so you can optionally sign up for email tips, like an email sequence of tips directly to your inbox. And that is it. That is episode 300. Thank you to everybody who's supported the podcast, especially the listeners. Thank you to all my past guests and all the companies, the people that donated to Unstarving Musician, and all the PR people that sent me some great guests too. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate you. And as I said, there are many other projects that can spin up from the archives of the interviews that I did. So be sure to follow on socials or sign up for liner notes on the website to stay abreast of all that. Thanks for listening. If you do not yet have a website for your music, check out Bandzoogle. It was created to help musicians and bands build their website and manage direct-to-fan marketing and sales. Bandzoogle has amazing design options, a commission-free store to sell music, merch, tickets, and more, plus tools that can capture detailed fan data for you. Try it free at bandzoogle.com. Use the promo code ROBONZO, ROBONZO, to get 15% off your first year. Thank you for listening. You can leave us feedback, questions, comments, complaints at unstarvingmusician.com/feedback. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you love this podcast, please visit unstarvingmusician.com/crowd-sponsor to learn about the many ways of showing your love and support. Your support does indeed equal love. The series music you heard in this episode is New Gods Part 2 by yours truly. Find links for all the places to hear the full version with vocals by yours truly at robonzo.com. Find links for all the people and things talked about in this episode at unstarvingmusician.com. Peace, love, and a whole lot of gratitude.